Hey guys, tonight we are diving headfirst into a topic so utterly mundane yet profoundly impactful, you might just fall asleep thinking about it. Actually, that's the goal. Imagine this with me for a moment. You're hunched over a desk, a flickering tallow candle casting long, dancing shadows across a vast, vellum page. The air is thick with the scent of beeswax and old parchment. Your fingers ache, your eyes burn. Outside, the chill of a monastic cloister seeps through the stone walls, making your breath mist in the frigid air. You've been at this for hours, perhaps since before dawn, meticulously copying scripture or a classical text. Every stroke of your quill a tiny, precise act of devotion or scholarship. The silence is broken only by the scratching of your pen and the occasional rustle of a page. Your head starts to nod, your vision blurs. A sudden jolt brings you back, your quill leaving an unfortunate blob of ink on the pristine surface. You probably won't survive this kind of intellectual grind without a serious case of carpal tunnel and a perpetually sore neck. This was the life of a medieval scribe, a life of relentless, painstaking labor. And tonight, we are going to explore how these unsung heroes of literacy, these diligent copyists, might have inadvertently invented something we all cherish deeply, the nap. Yes, that glorious, restorative micro-sleep that carries you through the afternoon slump. It wasn't a corporate wellness initiative or a trending lifestyle hack. It was born, as many great things are, from necessity and sheer, unadulterated exhaustion. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening, let me know where you are and what time it is for you right now. It is 5:36 p.m. in Ireland here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. We begin our quiet exploration not with a sudden epiphany, but with the slow, creeping fatigue that permeated the medieval scriptorium. It was a place of dedicated toil, a sanctuary of learning, yes, but also a crucible of physical and mental endurance. Think of the sheer volume of work. Books were not printed. Every single letter, every single illustration was rendered by hand. Imagine the repetition, the strain on the eyes from deciphering often faint or faded source material, the cramped positions, the inadequate lighting. Candlelight, as romantic as it sounds, was a poor substitute for modern illumination. It flickered, it smoked, and it cast more shadows than light, making an already demanding task even more challenging. The days were long, governed by the monastic horarium, a strict schedule of prayers and labor that began in the pre-dawn hours and stretched well into the evening. You would rise with the first bells, sometimes as early as 2 or 3 in the morning, and immediately begin your work. There was no concept of a 9-to-5 workday. Your entire life revolved around the rhythms of the monastery and the endless pursuit of copying. The act of writing itself, with a quill made from a bird's feather and ink concocted from soot, gallnuts, and other natural ingredients, was far from effortless. You had to constantly sharpen your quill, dip it precisely, and control the flow of ink to avoid smudges and blots. Each letter was an exercise in precision and discipline. A single mistake could ruin an entire page, requiring either a painstaking correction or worse, starting over. And the vellum or parchment itself, made from animal skins, was an expensive commodity. You couldn't just discard a sheet because of a momentary lapse in concentration. This pressure, this relentless demand for perfection, combined with the sheer physical discomfort, created an environment ripe for fatigue. You might find yourself drifting, your mind wandering, the carefully formed letters on the page starting to blur into an illegible script. It was a battle not just against the blank page, but against your own body's insistent demands for rest. The very air in the scriptorium, often unheated or minimally heated, added another layer of discomfort. In winter, your fingers would be stiff with cold, making fine motor control even harder. In summer, the lack of air circulation could make the space stuffy and oppressive, further draining your energy. You might try to warm your hands over a small brazier, but the relief would be fleeting. It wasn't just the physical strain, but the mental monotony that played its part. Imagine copying the same text, word for word, page after page, for weeks or even months. The content might be profound, but the process was repetitive in the extreme. Your mind, even if engaged with the meaning of the text, would eventually yearn for a break, a shift in focus. It's a bit like trying to read a very long, complex legal document when you're already half asleep. You understand the words, but the meaning just doesn't quite stick. This was the backdrop against which the medieval scribe operated. a tireless cog in the grand machine of knowledge preservation. And it's within this demanding reality that the tiny, rebellious act of the nap, a momentary surrender to exhaustion, began to take root. You can almost see it, can't you? A scribe, perhaps leaning back in his chair, eyes closed for just a moment, hoping no one, especially the abbot, notices. It's a very human response to an inhuman schedule, a silent rebellion against the tyranny of the quill and the endless page. Historians still argue whether these brief periods of unconsciousness were sanctioned breaks or stealthy acts of defiance, but the evidence points to their undeniable presence. The human body, after all, has its limits. You see, the medieval world, for all its structural rigidity, wasn't entirely devoid of an understanding of the body's needs, even if that understanding was rudimentary by modern standards. There was no elaborate sleep science, no studies on REM cycles or circadian rhythms. But common sense, born from experience, often dictated certain practicalities. Farmers, for instance, knew that animals needed rest, and even they, working in the fields under the sun, would sometimes seek shade for a brief respite. It was simply the way things were. And for the scribes, whose work was arguably even more mentally taxing than physical labor, the need for a brief mental reset must have been overwhelming at times. Imagine the sheer mental fatigue. You're not just copying letters. You're preserving knowledge. You're a human printing press, and any error could propagate through future copies, affecting centuries of understanding. The weight of that responsibility alone could make you want to lie down and stare at the ceiling for a bit. There were no coffee breaks, no energy drinks, no quick trips to the vending machine for a sugar hit. Sustenance was simple, often just bread, ale, and perhaps some seasonal vegetables or cheese. This diet, while sufficient for survival, wasn't exactly designed to provide a continuous surge of energy. So, when fatigue hit, there weren't many quick fixes available. The only real remedy was rest. And a full night's sleep, while important, often felt insufficient given the early starts and late finishes. This is where the concept of a meridian sleep, or noon sleep, starts to subtly emerge from the historical shadows. While not formally codified as a mandatory break in all monastic rules, the practical reality of sustained intellectual labor likely necessitated it. A quirky tidbit. Some monastic rules did actually allow for a short period of rest during the hottest part of the day, especially in warmer climates. This wasn't necessarily a nap in the modern sense, but a period of quiet contemplation or light activity, which could easily seg you into a doze for the truly exhausted. Think of it as a historical siesta, but for scholars rather than agricultural workers. You're not just battling the physical demands of writing, but the relentless ticking of time itself. The dwindling daylight hours that limited your work, especially in winter. The pressure to complete a manuscript, to meet the abbot's expectations, to honor the patron who commissioned the work, all weighed heavily. So, a quick, stealthy nap, a few minutes of blissful oblivion, could be the difference between completing a page accurately and making a costly error. It was a desperate measure, born not of laziness, but of a profound need to recharge and maintain productivity. Historians still argue whether the allowance for a meridian sleep was a concession to human frailty or a strategic recognition of the benefits of rest for sustained intellectual output. It's a chicken and egg situation, isn't it? Did they allow it because scribes were already doing it, or did they introduce it and scribes then took full advantage? You can almost picture the hushed whispers in the scriptorium, the subtle shift in posture as a scribe succumbed to the irresistible pull of sleep, perhaps feigning deep thought or careful examination of a text. The watchful eye of the supervisor, often another monk, would likely tolerate these brief lapses, understanding that pushing a scribe to absolute exhaustion was counterproductive. A tired scribe was a sloppy scribe, and sloppy scribes produced imperfect manuscripts, which was a far greater sin than a few minutes of unauthorized slumber. The very act of copying was meditative in its own way. The rhythmic scratch of the quill, the repetitive motions, the silent concentration, it could all contribute to a trance-like state, a gateway to sleep. Imagine the sheer quietness of these places. No humming computers, no distant traffic, no buzzing phones. Just the sounds of the scriptorium itself. This profound silence, while conducive to focus, could also be an amplifier for the body's natural inclination towards rest. It's not hard to imagine falling asleep in such an environment. And when you think about it, the invention of the nap wasn't a sudden, revolutionary moment. It was an organic evolution, a silent, almost invisible revolution against the relentless demands of medieval scholarship. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the undeniable power of a short snooze. You might even argue that the very existence of beautifully illuminated manuscripts, those breathtaking works of art that survive to this day, owes a debt to these brief moments of restorative rest. A well-rested scribe, after all, was more likely to produce a masterpiece than one teetering on the edge of collapse. It's a quiet legacy, isn't it? The humble nap, born not in a trendy wellness studio, but in the austere, ink-stained confines of a medieval monastery. It's a reminder that sometimes the most profound innovations aren't grand technological leaps, but simple, human adaptations to the demands of daily life. And it teaches us that even in the most rigid systems, there's always room for a little bit of glorious, restorative slumber. So, let's really dig into the nitty-gritty of a scribe's day to understand why the nap became less of an indulgence and more of a necessity. Your day would begin, as we touched upon, in the deep pre-dawn chill. The first bells, likely around 2 a.m., would jolt you from your meager bed. There was no hitting the snooze button, no lingering under the covers. You'd pull on your simple habit, probably still half asleep, and make your way to the communal prayers. Imagine the sheer discipline required for this. You're not just waking up early, you're waking up in complete darkness, in a cold monastery, to perform a series of often lengthy liturgical services. This alone would drain anyone's energy before the actual workday even began. After prayers, you would proceed directly to the scriptorium. There, by the dim, smoky light of a single candle, your labor would commence. The hours between approximately 3 a.m. and sunrise were often some of the most productive, surprisingly. This was the vigil period, a time of quiet contemplation and intense focus. But as the sun finally crept above the horizon, casting its pale light through the narrow windows, your body would already have accumulated hours of wakefulness and demanding work. The morning would continue with more prayers, perhaps a simple breakfast, and then back to the scriptorium for several more hours of copying. You'd be focused on the intricate details of letter forms, the precise ruling of lines, the careful application of pigments for illuminations. This wasn't just writing. It was an artistic and technical skill that required immense concentration. A mainstream historical fact here, monastic scriptoria were the primary centers of book production and preservation in Europe for nearly 1,000 years, effectively safeguarding ancient texts and knowledge through periods of immense societal upheaval. Without them, much of what we know about classical antiquity and early Christianity would have been lost forever. They were literally the libraries and publishing houses of their age. And in these incredibly important institutions, the scribes were the unsung heroes. Now, consider the instruments of their trade. You're holding a quill, likely a goose feather, painstakingly cut and shaped to create a fine point. You're dipping it into ink, which was often homemade, with varying consistencies. Sometimes it was too thin and bled into the parchment. Sometimes it was too thick and clogged the quill. This constant adjustment, this battle with your tools, added another layer of frustration and mental drain. A quirky tidbit is the method of drying the ink. There were no blotters as we know them. Often, scribes would sprinkle finely ground sand over the wet ink to absorb excess moisture, then gently brush it away. Imagine the precision required to do this, without smudging your freshly written lines, especially when your eyes were heavy and your movements were less than perfectly steady. It's a testament to their skill that so many of these manuscripts survived intact. The sheer physicality of the work also took its toll. You'd be seated, often on a hard stool, for hours on end, leaning over a sloped desk. Your back would ache, your neck would stiffen, and your wrist and fingers would cramp from the repetitive motion of the quill. There were no ergonomic chairs, no standing desks, no stretching breaks. You just endured, and all of this was happening in relative silence. The rules of the scriptorium often prohibited idle chatter. The only sounds would be the scratching of quills, the rustle of parchment, and perhaps the occasional cough or sigh. This intense quietness, while aiding concentration, also allowed your own fatigue to become amplified. You couldn't distract yourself with conversation or background noise. It was just you, the text, and the creeping weariness. Historians still argue whether the silence in the scriptorium was primarily for spiritual discipline or a practical measure to minimize distractions and preserve the sanctity of the work. It was probably a bit of both, but for our purposes, it certainly didn't help with staying awake. By midday, After perhaps 8 to 10 hours of intense, focused work, often on a less than ideal diet and with minimal natural light, your body would be screaming for a break. This wasn't just a slight dip in energy. This was a profound, a bone-deep exhaustion. Your eyelids would feel heavy, your head would droop, and the words on the page would begin to swim before your eyes. This is the moment, this precise tipping point of exhaustion, where the medieval scribe, whether consciously or instinctively, discovered the profound power of a brief nap. It wasn't a luxury. It was a survival mechanism, a way to reset the overloaded brain and allow the eyes to rest, even for a few precious minutes. It was a quiet revolution against the tyranny of the clock and the relentless demand for perfect, uninterrupted output. And it's a moment we can all empathize with, even today, when the demands of our own digital screens and endless information often leave us just as drained. The more things change, the more the human need for a little snooze remains profoundly the same. Now, let's zoom in on the actual act of napping within this monastic routine. It wasn't like clocking out for a scheduled power nap in a designated nap pod. Far from it. The nap of the medieval scribe was a furtive affair, a battle against the ever-present rules and the watchful eyes of superiors. You might find yourself subtly shifting in your seat, your head leaning against the hard wood of your desk, eyes drooping, your quill hand slowly relaxing. It would be a fine line to walk, appearing to be in deep contemplation, or perhaps just pausing to gather your thoughts, rather than openly succumbing to sleep. The consequences of outright laziness or insubordination could be severe, from penance to being deprived of certain privileges. So, the nap had to be a masterclass in subtlety. Imagine the skill involved in drifting off just enough to get some rest, but not so much that you started snoring or slumped completely. It required a delicate balance, almost an art form. A mainstream historical fact is that monastic life was heavily structured around the concept of opus dei, the work of God, which included both prayer and physical labor. Every minute of the day was accounted for, and idleness was considered a sin. This made any form of unsanctioned rest a transgression, however small. Yet, the very human body, despite all spiritual discipline, sometimes has other plans. You're trying to maintain a facade of industry, perhaps with your eyes still technically open, gazing blankly at the parchment, but your mind is already miles away, drifting through the tranquil fields of unconsciousness. It's a silent, internal struggle between duty and exhaustion. A quirky tidbit from some medieval texts suggests that scribes sometimes used special weights or clamps to hold down the pages of their manuscripts, perhaps to prevent them from curling. But also, one might speculate, to give them a convenient excuse to lean against something substantial if a sudden wave of drowsiness hit. It's a bit of a stretch, perhaps, but it certainly paints a vivid picture of the lengths one might go to for a momentary respite.
The sheer ingenious desperation!
You might have even developed a particular slouch, a specific way of resting your chin on your hand that allowed for a brief flicker of sleep while still appearing engaged. It was a performance, a subtle act of rebellion against the relentless demands of the scriptorium. Historians still argue whether the occasional references to monks sleeping during the day in some monastic records were acknowledgements of human frailty or stern warnings against succumbing to sloth. It's hard to tell from the often austere language of these rules, but the mere mention suggests it was a recurring issue. The nap, in this context, wasn't a luxury. It was a necessary, almost biological imperative. Your brain, having processed countless lines of text, having focused on intricate details for hours, would simply reach its limit. Neuroscientists today would talk about cognitive overload, about the brain's need to consolidate information and clear out metabolic byproducts. The medieval scribe, without this scientific language, experienced the raw, undeniable sensation of mental exhaustion. The benefits of these clandestine naps, however brief, would have been immediate and palpable. Even a few minutes of dozing could sharpen your focus, clear the mental fog, and restore a sense of clarity. You might wake up with a jolt, momentarily disoriented, but then your eyes would snap back into focus on the page, and the letters would no longer blur. Your hand, which moments ago felt heavy and clumsy, would regain some of its precision. It's the difference between trying to solve a complex puzzle after an all-nighter and tackling it after a quick refresh. The improvement in performance would have been undeniable, even if unspoken. This silent, unscheduled self-care was crucial for maintaining the quality of the manuscripts. A scribe who was consistently sleep-deprived would inevitably make more errors, produce less legible script, and suffer from a general decline in output. So, in a strange, almost ironic way, these unsanctioned naps might have actually improved the overall productivity and accuracy of the scriptorium, despite being technically forbidden. You were doing your part for the preservation of knowledge, even if it meant bending a rule or two in the process. It's a powerful reminder that human nature, with its inherent needs for rest and rejuvenation, often finds a way to assert itself, even in the most disciplined and demanding environments. The medieval scribe, in his quiet pursuit of knowledge, inadvertently laid the groundwork for a practice we all now embrace: the glorious, life-affirming power of the nap. And perhaps, as you drift off tonight, you can offer a silent nod of thanks to those diligent, often drowsy, scholars of old. Let's consider the environment of the scriptorium again, not just as a place of work, but as a silent conspirator in the invention of the nap. The very architecture, the lighting, the temperature, all played a part in encouraging the brief escape into slumber. Imagine the light, or rather, the lack thereof. In an era before electricity, natural light was paramount. Scriptoriums were often built with large windows, sometimes facing north to provide consistent, diffused light, avoiding harsh glare. However, even with ample windows, the light would vary significantly throughout the day, and more importantly, throughout the year. On a dreary winter day, or as dusk began to fall, the light would diminish rapidly, making the intricate work of copying incredibly taxing on the eyes. This fading light, combined with the often flickering candlelight, created a perpetual strain, an optical fatigue that would inevitably lead to drowsiness. You're squinting, leaning closer, trying to make out the faint script of your exemplar, and your eyes just start to rebel. It's an involuntary response, a primal urge to close them and give them a break. A mainstream historical fact is that the design of scriptoria, particularly in larger monastic centers, evolved over centuries to maximize natural light and often included individual carrels or workstations to provide a degree of privacy and focus. This design, while beneficial for concentration, also inadvertently created little nooks where a scribe could potentially snatch a few moments of rest with less chance of being observed. It's like your cubicle at work, but made of stone and smelling faintly of parchment. A quirky tidbit. Some scholars suggest that the widespread use of spectacles among older scribes in the later Middle Ages, a relatively early adoption of corrective lenses, underscores the severe eye strain inherent in the work. You can imagine a scribe, perhaps in his 50s, painstakingly peering through crude lenses, his eyes burning, the words starting to dance on the page. A brief nap would be less a luxury and more a desperate measure to preserve what little vision he had left. The body, even if the mind resisted, would demand rest. Historians still argue whether the increased use of artificial lighting sources like oil lamps or improved candles in later medieval periods genuinely extended working hours or simply made existing hours less physically taxing on the eyes. It's a debate about efficiency versus endurance. But regardless, the initial conditions were harsh. The temperature in the scriptorium was another factor. In winter, as we mentioned, it could be bone-achingly cold. In summer, especially in southern Europe, it could be stiflingly hot and humid. Extreme temperatures, whether hot or cold, are notoriously draining on the human body. They require your system to work harder just to maintain a stable core temperature, contributing to overall fatigue. You're not just trying to stay awake. You're trying to stay warm or cool enough to function, which saps your energy even further. Imagine trying to concentrate on complex Latin grammar when your fingers are numb with cold or your forehead is slick with sweat. Not exactly ideal conditions for peak cognitive performance. The air quality wasn't always stellar either. With candles and perhaps small braziers for warmth, the air could become thick with smoke and soot, leading to headaches and a general sense of sluggishness. It's like being stuck in a poorly ventilated room all day, every day. Your brain, deprived of fresh, clean air, would inevitably start to slow down. And then there's the silence. While beneficial for concentration, the profound quiet of the scriptorium could also be a powerful amplifier of fatigue. There were no distractions, no background chatter, no music to keep your mind stimulated. Just the rhythmic scratching of quills, a sound that, paradoxically, could become almost soporific in its regularity. It's like listening to a gentle, steady rain. While it can help you focus, it can just as easily lull you to sleep. You might find yourself staring at a blank wall, or the patterns of light on the floor, your mind slowly emptying of all thought, preparing for that sweet oblivion. This environmental cocktail of dim light, uncomfortable temperatures, poor air quality, and profound silence created a perfect storm for drowsiness. It's a subtle but significant point. The nap wasn't just a personal failing of the scribe. It was a nearly inevitable consequence of the very conditions under which they labored. It was the environment itself, almost a silent accomplice, that pushed the scribes towards those brief, restorative moments of sleep. So, the next time you find yourself struggling to stay awake in a dimly lit, quiet room, remember your medieval ancestors. They too succumbed to the gentle persuasion of their surroundings, finding solace and renewed energy in the quiet invention of the nap. It's a testament to the enduring power of human physiology, a quiet triumph over challenging circumstances. The monastic rules, while strict, sometimes contained surprising loopholes or interpretations that inadvertently facilitated the invention of the nap. While outright idleness was condemned, the concept of rest for the purpose of renewed labor was occasionally recognized, albeit subtly. This was not a universal decree, but a nuanced understanding that some abbots or monastic leaders might have held. You see, the goal was not to make the scribes suffer, but to maximize their output and the quality of their work for the glory of God and the preservation of knowledge. A scribe who collapsed from exhaustion was of no use to anyone. So, there was a pragmatic element at play. If a brief period of rest meant a clearer mind and fewer errors, it could be implicitly tolerated. A mainstream historical fact to consider is that some monastic orders, particularly those emphasizing manual labor, incorporated a meridian break in their daily schedule, a period in the middle of the day where monks might withdraw to their cells for rest or private prayer. While primarily intended for spiritual contemplation or quiet activity, it's not hard to imagine this evolving into a legitimate opportunity for a brief nap, especially for those engaged in intense intellectual work. It's a bit like your lunch break. Technically you're supposed to eat, but sometimes a quick power nap in your car or at your desk just happens. A quirky tidbit is the anecdotal evidence found in some monastic chronicles, where abbots occasionally admonished monks for being too prone to sleep during designated prayer times, but rarely, if ever, for briefly dozing off in the scriptorium. This suggests a subtle distinction in the eyes of the leadership. Sleeping during prayer was a spiritual failing, but sleeping during work, perhaps, was a sign of extreme dedication and exhaustion, and thus more forgivable. It's a fine line, isn't it? Being so dedicated to your work that you simply fall asleep at your desk. Historians still argue whether the apparent leniency towards napping in some monastic contexts was a sign of a more enlightened approach to labor, or simply a practical concession to the undeniable demands of the work. It's likely a combination of both. The very nature of the texts being copied also played a role. Many manuscripts were sacred texts, scriptures, or theological commentaries. Copying these wasn't just a mechanical task. It was a spiritual exercise, a form of devotion. The concentration required for such a task was immense, and the mental fatigue would be profound. You're not just writing words, you're engaging with profound spiritual truths. This level of engagement, while elevating, was also immensely draining. It's like trying to maintain a deep meditative state for hours on end. Eventually, your brain just says, nope. The alternative to napping was often error, and errors in sacred texts were a serious matter. Imagine copying a theological treatise and accidentally omitting a crucial word, or miswriting a date that would throw off centuries of historical understanding. The stakes were high. So, in a strange way, the nap became a preventative measure, a safeguard against mistakes that could have long-lasting consequences. It was better to briefly disengage and recharge than to continue in a state of diminished capacity and risk corrupting the text. You were, in essence, investing a few minutes of sleep to protect the integrity of the manuscript. This wasn't about being lazy, it was about being responsible. The medieval scribe, in his quiet pursuit of knowledge, was essentially engaged in early forms of quality control. And sometimes, quality control involved a brief period of unconsciousness. The very rhythm of monastic life, with its emphasis on cycles of prayer, work and rest, even if imperfectly applied, also contributed to the environment where naps could flourish. There were designated times for meals, for communal readings, for spiritual introspection. These pauses, however brief, provided natural breaks in the intensity of the work, and could be utilized by the wary scribe for a quick mental reset. You wouldn't suddenly get up and stretch or go for a walk, but you might lean back, close your eyes, and allow yourself to drift. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in focus, but one that could be profoundly restorative. The enduring legacy of the medieval scribe, therefore, is not just in the beautiful manuscripts they preserved, but also in the quiet, universal practice of the nap. It's a testament to the ingenuity of the human spirit, finding ways to adapt and survive even in the most demanding of circumstances. So, the next time you feel that irresistible urge to close your eyes for a few minutes in the middle of the day, remember that you're not just being lazy. You're participating in a centuries-old tradition, one perfected by scholars in dimly lit scriptoria, all in the name of productivity and the preservation of knowledge. It's a truly noble heritage, isn't it? Let's talk about the tools of the trade and how their limitations directly contributed to the fatigue that drove scribes to invent the nap. Imagine trying to write with a quill pen for hours on end. It's not like clicking a ballpoint or tapping on a keyboard. A quill, made from a bird's feather, usually a goose or swan, required constant attention. You had to sharpen its tip frequently with a small knife, a process called nibs making, to maintain a fine, consistent point. A dull quill produced thick, uneven lines. A too sharp one could tear the delicate parchment. This wasn't a quick sharpening either. It was a precise, often tedious task. Every few lines, or every paragraph, you might need to stop and resharpen, interrupting your flow and adding to the overall mental and physical burden. A mainstream historical fact is that the quality of quills was a significant concern for scribes, and specialized craftsmen sometimes prepared and sold them. This highlights how crucial this seemingly simple tool was to their daily work. You're not just writing, you're engaging in continuous tool maintenance. And then there's the ink. Medieval inks were usually made from gallnuts, iron salts, and gum arabic, creating a dark, iron gall ink. But the consistency could vary wildly. Sometimes it was too watery, bleeding into the parchment and ruining the page. Other times it was too thick, refusing to flow properly from the quill, requiring constant dipping and nudging. You might find yourself constantly stirring the ink pot, trying to achieve the perfect viscosity. This battle with recalcitrant ink added layers of frustration and wasted time, contributing to the overall exhaustion. A quirky tidbit is that some scribes were known to add various substances to their ink, from wine to even urine, in an attempt to improve its flow or color saturation. Imagine the olfactory experience of working in a medieval scriptorium. Not exactly aromatherapy, is it? It's a testament to their dedication, or perhaps their desperation, to get the ink just right. Historians still argue whether variations in ink recipes and quill preparation techniques led to significant differences in scribe productivity and overall output across different monasteries. It's a fascinating thought, isn't it, that the chemical composition of your ink could dictate your energy levels. The parchment itself was another source of struggle. Made from animal skins, sheep, calf, or goat, parchment was expensive and labor-intensive to prepare. It had to be carefully scraped, stretched, and smoothed to create a suitable writing surface. But even the best parchment wasn't always uniform. You might encounter thin spots that tore easily, or greasy spots that resisted ink absorption. You'd have to adjust your pressure, your speed, your very technique from one section of the page to the next. It's like trying to write neatly on a piece of paper that keeps changing its texture and absorbency. This constant adaptation, this lack of uniformity, added another layer of mental strain. You're not just copying, you're wrestling with your materials. And let's not forget the ruling of the pages. Before writing, each page had to be meticulously ruled with faint lines to ensure straight, even script. This involved pricking the parchment with a sharp tool and then drawing lines with a lead stylus or a blunt instrument. This was a painstaking and repetitive task, often done before the actual copying began, further extending the hours spent in preparation. It's like having to hand draw all the lines on your notebook paper before you can even start writing your essay. This preparatory work, while essential for the aesthetic and legibility of the manuscript, added significant time and contributed to the overall physical and mental fatigue, even before the first word was written. The sheer volume of material to be copied was also staggering. A single Bible, for example, could take a team of scribes years to complete. Imagine the immense satisfaction, but also the daunting prospect of facing thousands upon thousands of pages, knowing that every single letter had to be perfect. The cumulative effect of this relentless, painstaking labor, performed with imperfect tools and demanding materials, was an overwhelming sense of fatigue. Your eyes would burn, your hand would cramp, and your brain would feel like a fog. The very act of forming each letter became a monumental effort. So, when the medieval scribe finally succumbed to the irresistible pull of sleep, it wasn't out of idleness. It was a direct consequence of the extraordinary demands of their craft, amplified by the limitations of their tools and materials. The nap, in this light, becomes an almost heroic act of self-preservation, a testament to the human body's ingenious ability to find moments of respite, even in the most challenging of circumstances. They truly earned their naps, didn't they? And in doing so, they gave us all a silent permission slip to indulge in our own moments of restorative slumber. Let's turn our attention to the intellectual demands placed upon medieval scribes, which went far beyond mere copying and further intensified the need for restorative naps. You weren't just a human photocopier. You were often a scholar, a linguist, and sometimes even an artist. Many scribes were proficient in Latin, the lingua franca of medieval scholarship and the church, but often they were also working with texts in Greek, Hebrew, or even early vernacular languages. Imagine needing to not just read, but perfectly transcribe text in multiple ancient languages, some with complex scripts and grammatical structures. It's like trying to type a research paper in 3 different programming languages simultaneously, all while half asleep. This linguistic dexterity required immense mental effort and vigilance. A mainstream historical fact is that many medieval scriptoria also functioned as centers of translation, with monks undertaking the monumental task of rendering classical and theological works into more accessible languages, or from one ancient language to another. This added another layer of intellectual complexity, as you were not just copying, but interpreting and representing ideas. This intellectual burden, far more than simple manual labor, was profoundly draining. A quirky tidbit involves the practice of glossing. Scribes would often add marginal notes, or glosses, to the text they were copying. These could be explanations of difficult words, cross-references, or even personal commentaries. While useful for future readers, the act of adding these glosses required active engagement with the text, critical thinking, and the ability to synthesize information. It wasn't just mindless transcription. It was a form of active scholarship. Imagine doing all of that while fighting off the overwhelming urge to doze. Historians still argue whether the practice of glossing significantly increased the intellectual burden on scribes, leading to greater fatigue, or if it provided a welcome intellectual stimulation that helped to stave off monotony. It's probably a bit of both, but there's no denying it added to the mental load. Furthermore, scribes were often responsible for checking and correcting errors in the texts they were copying. This was not a passive process. You had to actively compare your work against the exemplar, searching for discrepancies, omissions, or misspellings. This proofreading function required an acute attention to detail, a sharp eye, and an unwavering focus. One misplaced letter could change the entire meaning of a word, or even a sentence. It's like being a live editor, constantly on guard for mistakes, knowing that every error you miss will propagate. The mental effort involved in this constant vigilance was enormous. The content of the manuscripts also played a significant role in inducing fatigue. Many texts were dense philosophical treatises, intricate theological arguments, or complex scientific works. Engaging with such material, even through the act of copying, required a certain level of mental processing. You couldn't simply switch off your brain and mechanically reproduce the letters. Your mind, even subconsciously, would be grappling with the concepts, trying to make sense of the intricate arguments. This deep cognitive engagement, while enriching, was also incredibly draining. It's the difference between reading a light novel and studying for a difficult exam. The latter is far more exhausting. And then there were the illuminations. For some scribes, particularly those with artistic talent, the work extended to creating intricate illustrations, ornate initial letters, and decorative borders. This was an entirely different skill set, requiring a steady hand, a keen eye for color and design, and meticulous precision. The hours spent hunched over a page, applying delicate brushstrokes with expensive pigments, were physically and mentally demanding. It's like being an artisan and a copyist at the same time, switching between 2 demanding roles. This added layer of artistic endeavor, while providing a beautiful visual element to the manuscripts, undeniably contributed to the overall fatigue. The confluence of linguistic demands, critical editing, deep intellectual engagement with complex texts, and often artistic creation meant that the scribe's brain was constantly working at a high intensity. It was a mental marathon, day in and day out. So, when the inevitable wave of exhaustion washed over you, it wasn't just physical weariness. It was profound intellectual fatigue. Your brain, having processed so much information, having been so intensely focused for so many hours, simply demanded a reboot. And that reboot, more often than not, came in the form of a brief, restorative nap. It was a silent testament to the brain's own brilliant self-preservation mechanism, a quiet, involuntary strike against intellectual burnout. The medieval scribe, in his diligent pursuit of knowledge, truly earned every single one of his precious, life-giving snoozes. Let's delve deeper into the societal and spiritual context of medieval monasticism, which inadvertently fostered the conditions for the acceptance, however implicit, of the scribe's nap. The entire system was built on a foundation of intense devotion and disciplined labor, all aimed at the glory of God. However, even within this strict framework, there was a subtle acknowledgement of human limitations. The monastic life, as prescribed by rules like that of Saint Benedict, was not merely about prayer but also about manual labor and intellectual pursuits. The phrase ora et labora, or pray and work, encapsulated this ethos. The work of copying manuscripts was seen as a sacred duty, a way to preserve divine wisdom and propagate Christian teachings. This elevated status of their work meant that scribes were often seen as vital contributors to the spiritual well-being of the community, not just mere laborers. A mainstream historical fact is that the Benedictine order, with its emphasis on regular prayer and work, played a pivotal role in the preservation of classical and Christian texts during the early Middle Ages, effectively becoming the intellectual backbone of Europe. Their structured daily life, while demanding, also provided a certain rhythm that could, for the truly exhausted, offer moments of respite. You're not just an individual laborer, you are part of a larger, divinely ordained enterprise. This sense of collective purpose could be motivating, but also intensely draining. A quirky tidbit is that some monastic libraries even had specific rules about the handling of books, emphasizing their sacred nature and often referring to them as treasures. Imagine working with material so revered, knowing that any mistake you made could be seen as a defilement of a sacred object. This added a psychological weight to the already demanding physical and intellectual tasks. Historians still argue whether the highly communal nature of monastic life, despite its emphasis on individual discipline, fostered a subtle mutual understanding among monks about the inevitable fatigue, leading to a de facto acceptance of brief periods of rest. It's not hard to imagine one monk observing another nodding off and quietly turning a blind eye, understanding that he himself might soon be in the same boat. There was a shared experience of the rigorous daily schedule. The concept of penance for sins was central to monastic life. However, certain transgressions were viewed differently. A monk who openly shirked his duties out of laziness would face severe penance. But a monk who, through sheer exhaustion, momentarily succumbed to sleep while performing a vital task like copying, might be seen as a different case entirely. It wasn't intentional idleness. It was a consequence of intense devotion and relentless labor. The spiritual leaders, while stern, were also often pragmatic. They understood that pushing human beings beyond their physical and mental limits was counterproductive and could lead to more serious errors or even illness. The welfare of the scribe, though not always paramount, was certainly a consideration in maintaining the overall efficiency of the scriptorium. A sick or utterly depleted scribe could not work at all, which was far worse than a few minutes of napping. So, in a strange, almost circular logic, the very intensity of the monastic regimen created the conditions where brief, unsanctioned naps became an unstated, yet understood, part of the daily grind. It was a form of self-preservation, implicitly acknowledged if never officially sanctioned. The nap became a silent act of grace, a moment of compassion for the human vessel struggling to fulfill a divine mission. You were doing your best, working until your eyes burned and your hand cramped, and sometimes the body just demanded its due. This was not a moral failing, but a biological reality. And in a society where physical and mental endurance were highly valued, the ability to push through, even with the occasional brief collapse, was likely seen as a testament to one's commitment. It was a tacit understanding, a shared secret among those who bore the immense responsibility of preserving knowledge for future generations. The medieval scribe, in his quiet struggle against fatigue, didn't just invent the nap for himself. He demonstrated a universal human need that transcends time and culture. And as you prepare for your own slumber, Remember that long before fancy ergonomic chairs and sophisticated sleep trackers, these diligent individuals discovered the profound restorative power of a few precious minutes of unconsciousness, all while serving a higher purpose. It's a truly humbling thought, isn't it? Let's paint a more vivid picture of the specific moments when these naps might have occurred, truly embedding us in the scribe's lived experience. Imagine it's the quiet afternoon, typically after the midday meal and prayers, a period known as nons, in the monastic schedule, often around 3 p.m. This is precisely when the human body's natural circadian rhythm dips, that notorious afternoon slump we all know too well. For the medieval scribe, who had likely been awake and working for at least 12 hours straight by this point, this dip would be profoundly pronounced. The modest meal of bread and ale would only serve to increase the feeling of lethargy. You're back at your carrel. The light outside might be softening, casting longer shadows across the scriptorium floor. Your eyes, already tired from the morning's efforts, would feel gritty, as if filled with sand. Your head would feel heavy, perhaps throbbing faintly from the sustained concentration. This is the prime time for the meridian sleep to sneak in. A mainstream historical fact is that monastic schedules, while varying slightly by order and region, generally included a period of quiet reflection or rest after the midday meal to aid digestion and prepare for further labor. This period, often called meridian or sext rest, was the most likely official or semi-official window for a quick doze, even if it wasn't explicitly called a nap. You're trying to read the exemplar, and the words just won't stay still. They blur, they swim, they transpose themselves in mischievous ways. Your quill hand feels unresponsive, heavy, and clumsy. You might find yourself staring blankly at a single letter, unable to process it, your mind a blank slate. A quirky tidbit involves the common medieval ailment known as writer's cramp, or scribe's palsy. While not directly linked to napping, the sheer repetitive strain on the hand and arm would contribute to overall exhaustion and discomfort, making any relief, even a brief doze, incredibly appealing. Imagine your hand aching so much that simply resting it for a few minutes feels like a miraculous reprieve. Historians still argue whether the monastic practice of allowing short breaks for spiritual reading or quiet reflection was a deliberate method of managing scribe fatigue, or simply a religiously mandated period that scribes opportunistically used for rest. It's a tricky distinction, isn't it, between spiritual contemplation and accidental slumber. You might try to fight it, of course. You might pinch yourself or stand up for a moment, or even try to splash some cold water on your face if there was any readily available. But the pull of sleep, that irresistible biological demand, would often prove too strong. You'd lean back, perhaps closing your eyes, intending just a moment of rest, and then suddenly, you'd be jolted awake, unsure if it had been seconds or minutes. The short jolt, the sudden return to consciousness, would be accompanied by a brief moment of disorientation. But then, the immediate benefits would kick in. Your eyes would feel less strained, the fog in your brain would have lifted, and you'd find a renewed, albeit temporary, clarity. The words on the page would snap back into focus. Your hand, though still tired, would feel a little more responsive. It was a miraculous reset, a brief injection of energy that allowed you to push through the next block of hours. This cycle of intense work, followed by creeping fatigue, followed by a brief, restorative nap, was likely a recurring pattern in the scribe's day. It was a rhythm dictated not by rules, but by the relentless demands of the human body and mind. The nap wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a testament to endurance, a subtle rebellion against an overwhelming workload, a quiet assertion of human need in a rigid system. It was the only way to sustain the intense intellectual and physical labor required to produce those magnificent manuscripts that survive to this day. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps consider the silent, unspoken pact between the medieval scribe and his exhaustion. A pact that gave birth to one of humanity's most cherished simple pleasures, the nap. It's a quiet legacy, isn't it, woven into the very fabric of our shared human experience. The invention of the nap by medieval scribes wasn't just a physical or mental adaptation. It had subtle, yet profound, cultural implications that resonate even today. Consider how this seemingly minor act of daily rest contributed to the broader culture of knowledge preservation. By allowing scribes to sustain their intense work, the nap indirectly ensured the survival and proliferation of texts that formed the bedrock of Western civilization. Without these moments of restorative sleep, the accuracy and sheer volume of copied manuscripts would have undoubtedly diminished, potentially leading to greater loss of ancient knowledge. A mainstream historical fact is that the fall of the Western Roman Empire led to a significant decline in literacy and formal education, and it was primarily monastic institutions and their scriptoria that kept the flame of learning alive, copying classical texts and theological works through what are often called the Dark Ages. Their diligence, even with naps, was vital. You can imagine the societal impact of a less accurate or less complete collection of knowledge. Without the nap, perhaps fewer texts would have been copied, or those that were copied would have contained more errors, leading to a poorer transmission of information to future generations. The humble nap, therefore, played an unsung role in safeguarding intellectual heritage. A quirky tidbit related to this is the presence of colophons in many medieval manuscripts. These were brief notes added by the scribe at the end of a text, often including details about the completion date, the difficulties encountered during copying, or even pleas for divine assistance. Some colophons even mention the scribe's fatigue or joy at finishing a particularly long or difficult work. While none explicitly mention taking a nap, their existence hints at the very human struggles of the copying process, struggles that a nap would undoubtedly alleviate. It's like finding a sticky note from a tired student on their finished exam, expressing their relief. Historians still argue whether the implicit acceptance of scribe fatigue, possibly leading to napping, contributed to a broader cultural understanding within medieval society about the value of rest for intellectual pursuits. Even if it wasn't formally articulated, it's a subtle shift, a quiet evolution of norms. The very existence of beautifully illuminated manuscripts, often requiring immense artistic and intellectual effort, stands as a testament to the fact that scribes were able to perform at a high level of quality despite the grueling conditions. The nap was likely one of the hidden mechanisms that allowed for this sustained excellence. It prevented burnout, preserved mental acuity, and allowed for the consistent focus necessary for such intricate work. You can imagine a scribe, having just woken from a brief doze, tackling an elaborate initial letter or a complex theological argument with renewed vigor, the previous mental fog having dissipated. The cultural impact also extends to the very concept of scholarly endurance. The medieval scribe became an archetype of diligent, painstaking labor. This image, however, often overlooks the underlying human need for rest. By inventing the nap, they subtly demonstrated that even the most dedicated scholar, engaged in the most sacred of tasks, still required moments of profound rest. It humanized the process of knowledge creation and preservation. It wasn't about superhuman effort, but about sustained, human effort, intelligently managed. This understanding, though unspoken, formed part of the cultural fabric of medieval scholarship. It acknowledged that the brain, like any muscle, needs periods of recovery. The absence of modern distractions also meant that when fatigue hit, there were fewer artificial stimulants to push through it. No strong coffee, no internet to scroll through, no loud music. Just the quietude of the scriptorium and the undeniable urge to close your eyes. This made the need for and the eventual acceptance of the nap almost inevitable. So, the next time you enjoy your own afternoon nap, remember that you are participating in a tradition far older than you might imagine, a tradition quietly pioneered by diligent medieval scribes who understood, long before sleep science existed, the profound and necessary power of a brief escape into slumber for the sake of preserving knowledge and enduring the relentless demands of their work. It's a quiet legacy, but a truly significant one. Let's consider the long-term impact of this invention of the nap on subsequent eras, moving beyond the medieval period. While printing presses eventually replaced the laborious hand copying of manuscripts, the fundamental human need for rest, particularly during periods of intense intellectual effort, remained. The medieval scribe's unintentional pioneering of the nap laid a subtle groundwork for its continued, albeit informal, acceptance in various professions that demanded sustained mental focus. Think about early modern scholars, philosophers, and scientists who continued to work long hours by candlelight, poring over texts and conducting experiments. They too would have faced similar battles with fatigue, and the natural human response, undoubtedly, would have included short periods of dozing. A mainstream historical fact is that even after the invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century, hand copying continued for a significant period, especially for specialized texts or personal copies, and the culture of long hours of study persisted for centuries. So the scribe's legacy of endurance and the implicit need for rest continued to shape intellectual work. You can imagine a Renaissance scholar surrounded by his newly printed books, still occasionally leaning back in his chair for a quick snooze after wrestling with a particularly dense Latin commentary. The mode of knowledge production changed, but the human brain remained the same. A quirky tidbit: it's said that some early modern scientists, like Isaac Newton, were known for their intense periods of work followed by equally intense periods of rest, sometimes involving brief naps. While not directly attributed to medieval scribes, it shows a continuation of the understanding that intense intellectual effort requires periods of mental recovery. Perhaps Newton was unknowingly channeling his inner medieval copyist. Historians still argue whether the persistent cultural acceptance of short daytime rests in academic and intellectual circles, even into the modern era, can be traced back to the practices necessitated by medieval scholarly life, forming an unbroken, if unspoken, tradition. It's a fascinating line to draw. The very concept of a power nap, a term coined much more recently, suggests a purposeful, efficient use of a short period of sleep to boost productivity. While the medieval scribe didn't have the term, they certainly practiced the concept. Their naps were, by necessity, power naps, brief, restorative, and aimed at enabling continued work. They were not leisurely indulgences but strategic resets. This pragmatism, born out of necessity, continued to be relevant even as technology advanced. Consider students throughout history, preparing for exams by burning the midnight oil. How many of them have found themselves succumbing to a short, unplanned nap at their desks, only to wake up feeling slightly refreshed and ready to tackle another chapter? The experience is universal, timeless. The medieval scribe's struggle and solution resonate deeply with anyone who has ever pushed their cognitive limits. The nap became an enduring, informal part of the scholarly toolkit, a silent acknowledgement of the brain's need for periodic, albeit brief, disengagement to maintain optimal function. It was a recognition that continuous, unbroken intellectual effort is simply unsustainable for most human beings. This subtle cultural thread, woven through centuries of intellectual pursuit, is a testament to the powerful, fundamental truth that the medieval scribes uncovered through sheer, overwhelming exhaustion that a little bit of sleep, strategically deployed, can be a game changer for mental performance. So, as you embrace your own moments of afternoon peace, remember the quiet, dedicated individuals who, out of necessity, pioneered this wonderful human tradition. They were the original biohackers, optimizing their brain function not with expensive supplements or elaborate routines, but with the simple, accessible magic of a quick snooze. Their legacy lives on every time someone leans back and closes their eyes for a few restorative moments. Let's explore the lasting impact of this invention of the nap on our modern understanding of rest and productivity. While the medieval scribes didn't conduct scientific studies, their lived experience provided empirical evidence of the nap's benefits. Their necessity became our research. Today, sleep scientists and productivity gurus regularly advocate for the power nap, citing cognitive benefits like improved alertness, enhanced memory, and boosted creativity. These modern findings, backed by sophisticated brain imaging and sleep studies, essentially validate what the medieval scribe discovered through trial and error. A brief period of unconsciousness can significantly improve mental function. A mainstream historical fact is that the concept of siesta, in many Mediterranean and Latin American cultures, a period of rest during the hottest part of the day, has ancient roots, often linked to agricultural rhythms and the need to escape the midday sun. While different in origin from the scribe's nap, both highlight a historical recognition of midday rest for continued productivity. You're not just taking a nap, you're participating in a long, unbroken chain of human knowledge about the brain. A quirky tidbit: some contemporary companies, recognizing the benefits of napping, are now incorporating nap pods or designated quiet rooms into their offices, a corporate acknowledgement of a practice that began, inadvertently, in medieval scriptoria. It's a strange full circle, isn't it? From the monastic carrel to the modern cubicle. Historians still argue whether the cultural normalization of daytime, napping in various professional contexts over centuries, is a direct result of medieval scholarly practices or a parallel development arising from similar human needs across different eras. It's difficult to pinpoint a direct causal link, but the shared experience is undeniable. The medieval scribe's nap, born of necessity, stands as a testament to the body's innate wisdom. They didn't need studies to tell them they were tired. Their bodies told them. They didn't need an app to track their sleep. They just felt the overwhelming urge to close their eyes. This intuitive understanding of human physiology is a powerful reminder that sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective. The very language we use today, power nap, cat nap, 40 winks, suggests a playful, almost affectionate regard for these short periods of sleep. This cultural acceptance, while perhaps not directly traceable to medieval scriptoria, certainly aligns with the human experience of fatigue that the scribes knew so well. They laid the experiential groundwork. The contrast between the rigid, disciplined life of the monastery and the informal, almost rebellious act of napping highlights the powerful triumph of biological necessity over strictures. It demonstrates that fundamental human needs will always find a way to assert themselves, regardless of the rules or expectations. This resilience, this quiet assertion of self-care, is a powerful part of their legacy. And think about the simple accessibility of the nap. It requires no special equipment, no expensive training. It's a natural, almost primal, response to exhaustion. This universality means that the invention of the nap by the medieval scribe is one that truly belongs to all of humanity. It's a shared heritage, a common experience across cultures and centuries. So as you settle into your bed tonight, or perhaps consider a short afternoon snooze tomorrow, remember the quiet, diligent figures who, through sheer exhaustion and dedication, inadvertently showed us the profound and necessary power of a brief escape into slumber. They were the original innovators of rest, and their legacy continues to shape our understanding of productivity and well-being. It's a quiet triumph, a silent revolution of the body, and a truly universal gift. Let's consider how the very scarcity of resources in the medieval scriptorium inadvertently amplified the need for, and thus the invention of the nap. Unlike today, where a quick mistake on a digital document can be instantly undone, scribes worked with incredibly valuable and often scarce materials. Parchment, as we discussed, was animal skin, painstakingly prepared. It was expensive, time-consuming to produce, and not easily replaceable. A single error, a clumsy smear of ink born from a moment of profound fatigue, could ruin an entire page, necessitating starting over on a fresh, costly sheet. This pressure to avoid mistakes, to maintain absolute precision, would have been immense. A mainstream historical fact is that the cost of parchment was a significant factor in manuscript production, often representing the largest material expense. This economic pressure would have directly translated into a heightened demand for accuracy and minimal waste from the scribes. You weren't just working. You were working with precious, non-renewable resources, making every stroke count. A quirky tidbit is that some medieval manuscripts show evidence of erased or scraped errors, known as erasures or palimpsests, where the original writing was scraped off to allow for new text. This was a tedious and often damaging process, further emphasizing the cost and effort involved in correcting mistakes. Imagine having to literally scratch away your error with a knife, hoping you didn't damage the page too much. It's like trying to erase a permanent marker with a razor blade. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of these erased manuscripts indicates a more forgiving approach to errors, or simply the extreme lengths to which scribes went to avoid wasting costly materials. It probably points to both, but the underlying pressure for accuracy is clear. The inks too, while seemingly simple, were often made from natural pigments that could be difficult to source and prepare. The wrong shade, a patchy application, or a spill could necessitate redoing an entire section, further wasting valuable time and resources. The pressure wasn't just about quantity, but quality. Every single page was a testament to the scribe's skill and the monastery's resources. The limited availability of light, especially during winter months, also imposed strict time constraints. You couldn't simply work around the clock under artificial illumination as we can today. When the light faded, work often had to cease, or continue under less than ideal conditions by flickering candlelight, which increased the risk of errors. This meant that the productive hours of daylight were incredibly valuable, and any time lost to mistakes due to fatigue was a significant setback. You were racing against the sun, quite literally. The very atmosphere of frugality and resourcefulness that permeated monastic life also contributed. Everything was used efficiently, nothing was wasted. This ethos would have discouraged reckless mistakes born of exhaustion, implicitly encouraging scribes to find ways to maintain their focus, even if that meant a brief, unscheduled rest. It was better to pause and recharge than to blunder and waste precious resources. This high-stakes environment, where every mark on the page represented significant material and labor investment, made the consequence of errors particularly severe. This pressure would have intensified the craving for any method that could reduce mistakes and maintain efficiency. The nap, in this context, was not a sign of weakness but a strategic act of self-preservation, a way to safeguard both the scribe's work and the monastery's precious resources. It was an unofficial quality control measure, a hidden factor in the cost-benefit analysis of manuscript production. So, the next time you marvel at a beautifully preserved medieval manuscript, remember that its perfection might owe a silent debt to the scribe who, battling exhaustion and the scarcity of materials, briefly leaned back and closed their eyes. It's a testament to the ingenuity born of necessity, a quiet story woven into the very parchment of history itself. Let's now turn our attention to the physical tolls that the medieval scribe's life exacted, going beyond mere fatigue, and how these bodily ailments made the nap not just desirable, but often a sheer necessity for survival and continued work. Imagine the conditions: you're hunched over a sloped desk, likely on a hard wooden stool, for hours on end. This posture alone would lead to chronic back pain, stiff necks, and rounded shoulders. There was no ergonomic design, no soft cushioning, no adjustable features. Your body was forced into an unnatural, static position for the majority of your waking hours. This constant physical strain would be a pervasive background noise to your intellectual work, draining your energy and making the allure of horizontal rest almost irresistible. A mainstream historical fact is that skeletal remains from medieval monastic cemeteries often show evidence of spinal deformities, arthritis, and other musculoskeletal issues, consistent with prolonged periods of sedentary, repetitive labor. You are literally feeling the aches and pains of your ancestors just through imagining their day. A quirky tidbit is that some medieval depictions of scribes show them with various contraptions, like weighted straps or stands, which were sometimes thought to aid posture or hold pages. While their effectiveness is debated, it speaks to the ongoing struggle with physical discomfort and the search for any small relief. It's like trying to find that perfect cushion for your office chair, but 1,000 years ago. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of certain chronic conditions among medieval monks, particularly scribes, directly impacted their overall productivity or simply made the work more arduous, requiring greater resilience and perhaps more frequent, if short, breaks. It was probably a little bit of both, but the cumulative effect was undeniable. The repetitive strain on the hand and arm from holding and manipulating the quill for hours would lead to what we now recognize as repetitive strain injuries. Your fingers would cramp, your wrist would ache, and your forearm muscles would burn. This wasn't just temporary discomfort. It could be a debilitating pain that made the very act of writing agonizing. A brief nap, even if taken sitting up, would provide a momentary cessation of this strain, allowing the muscles to relax and blood to flow more freely, offering a tiny respite from the relentless ache. Your eyes, as we've discussed, were under constant duress from poor lighting and the meticulous nature of the work. Eye strain would manifest as burning, dryness, blurred vision, and headaches. These symptoms, far from being minor annoyances, could be intensely distracting and debilitating, making sustained focus almost impossible. Closing your eyes, even for a few minutes, would provide a much-needed break for your tired optic nerves, allowing them to rest and reset. It's like the difference between staring at a bright screen for hours and then looking away into the distance for a few minutes. The relief is immediate and palpable. Beyond specific physical ailments, the general lack of sanitation and medical knowledge meant that even minor illnesses could be debilitating and prolonged. A simple cold or fever, which we might shrug off today with over-the-counter medication, could knock a scribe out for days or even weeks. This general state of physical vulnerability would make any restorative practice, like napping, even more crucial for maintaining health and functionality. You were constantly battling not just the work, but your own fragile human body in a world without modern medicine. The sheer physical toll of the medieval scribe's life made the nap not just a luxury, but a vital component of their survival strategy. It was a silent, unstated prescription for endurance, a necessary defense mechanism against the cumulative effects of pain, strain, and chronic discomfort. They weren't just inventing a habit, they were responding to the urgent demands of their own suffering bodies. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps consider the silent, aching bodies of those who came before us, and how their relentless toil and physical discomfort led them, inadvertently, to one of life's most simple and profound comforts, the nap. It's a physical legacy, etched into the very bones of history. Let's delve into the psychological landscape of the medieval scribe, the mental state that went beyond mere fatigue and truly cultivated the need for a nap. Imagine the immense pressure you were under. Not only was the physical act of copying arduous, but the intellectual and spiritual weight of the content was immense. You were dealing with sacred texts, philosophical treatises, and historical chronicles, often seen as divinely inspired or historically significant. Any error was not just a mistake. It could be a corruption of truth, a blot on a sacred legacy. This immense sense of responsibility could be psychologically crushing. A mainstream historical fact is that monastic life often included strict spiritual disciplines aimed at humility and the eradication of pride. But this spiritual rigor often came with immense internal pressure to perform flawlessly in all aspects of life, including intellectual work. You're not just trying to do a good job, you're trying to achieve perfection in the eyes of God. A quirky tidbit is the phenomenon of marginalia, where scribes would sometimes add small drawings, doodles, or even humorous or exasperated comments in the margins of their manuscripts. While sometimes instructional, these were often outlets for personal feelings, a silent form of venting. Imagine finding a tiny drawing of a sleeping figure next to a particularly dense passage. It's a silent confession of exhaustion. Historians still argue whether these personal marginalia represent moments of fleeting distraction or a deeper, psychological need for emotional release from the intense pressure of the work. It's likely a bit of both, but they certainly humanize the scribal experience. The monotony of the work, despite its intellectual depth, could also be profoundly draining. Hour after hour, day after day, week after week, copying the same types of texts, forming the same letters. Even the most intellectually stimulating content, when consumed in such a repetitive manner, can lead to a sense of mental stagnation and boredom. This mental tedium, paradoxically, can be just as exhausting as intense cognitive effort. Your mind, seeking any form of escape, might start to wander, or simply shut down. The sheer isolation of the work also played a part. While in a communal setting, the act of copying was largely solitary. There was little opportunity for casual conversation or intellectual discourse that might break the monotony. You were largely alone with your thoughts, your quill, and the page. This isolation, combined with the intense focus, could lead to a feeling of mental entrapment, a longing for a break from the relentless internal monologue. The stress of deadlines, though perhaps less formalized than today, was certainly present. Manuscripts were often commissioned by patrons or abbots, and there would be an expectation of timely completion. This pressure, combined with the already demanding nature of the work, could lead to anxiety and a heightened sense of urgency, further contributing to mental exhaustion. You're not just copying. You're racing against an invisible clock. Imagine the profound relief, the psychological release, that even a short nap could provide. It was a momentary escape from the relentless demands, a brief vacation from the pressure cooker of the scriptorium. It allowed the brain to disengage, to reset, to clear the mental clutter that accumulated from hours of intense focus and responsibility. This psychological release was arguably as important as the physical rest. It was a way for the scribe to maintain their sanity, to avoid complete mental breakdown from the crushing weight of their duties. The nap, in this light, becomes a form of psychological self-preservation, a mental hygiene practice born not of choice, but of dire necessity. So, as you think about the medieval scribe, remember not just the physical discomfort, but the profound mental and spiritual pressures they faced. Their invention of the nap was not just about overcoming tiredness. It was about maintaining psychological equilibrium in an extraordinarily demanding world. It's a quiet triumph of the human spirit, a testament to our innate need for moments of reprieve and mental reset. And in this shared human need, we find a timeless connection to those diligent, often wary scholars of old. Now, let's explore the unintended consequences of the medieval scribe's nap, specifically how it contributed to the evolution of reading and writing practices. While seemingly a simple act of rest, the nap might have subtly influenced the way texts were structured and consumed. Imagine a scribe who regularly experienced bouts of extreme fatigue. They might, perhaps subconsciously, begin to develop habits that facilitated their work, even when on the verge of dozing. This could include developing more consistent and legible handwriting, making the exemplar easier to follow even with blurred vision, or perhaps even a preference for larger script. A mainstream historical fact is that the development of more standardized scripts, such as Carolingian minuscule, in the early medieval period greatly improved the legibility and consistency of manuscripts, making them easier to read and copy. This standardization could have, in part, been driven by the practical need for clarity in a world where scribes were battling exhaustion. You're not just writing. You're designing a user-friendly experience for your perpetually tired self. A quirky tidbit from the history of reading is that the widespread adoption of spaces between words, rather than writing in scriptio continuous script without spaces, was a gradual process in the medieval period. Some scholars argue that this innovation made text significantly easier to read silently, reducing cognitive load, which would have been a huge benefit for a tired scribe trying to decipher an exemplar. Imagine trying to read a text without any spaces. It's like a never-ending run-on sentence. Historians still argue whether the transition to spaced script was primarily for the benefit of silent reading, or to reduce the intellectual burden on scribes, thereby indirectly acknowledging and accommodating their fatigue. It's a debate about reader comfort versus scribe efficiency. The NAP, by forcing scribes to confront their limits, might have pushed them towards innovations that made the copying process more efficient and less prone to errors when tired. This could include developing better systems for ruling pages, using consistent abbreviations, or even creating personal shorthand systems to speed up their work, thereby reducing the sheer volume of hours needed for a given text. It's a bit like modern programmers creating shortcuts to avoid repetitive coding. The very act of taking a brief nap and then returning to the text would highlight the areas of the manuscript that were particularly challenging to copy when fatigued. This feedback, however subconscious, could have influenced how future exemplars were prepared or even how texts were structured, perhaps encouraging the inclusion of more visual cues or simpler layouts. The scribes, through their own struggle, became unintentional UX designers for future generations of copyists and readers. The gradual introduction of features like chapter divisions, paragraph breaks, and even punctuation marks, while serving broader purposes, also made text more digestible and less daunting for a fatigued reader or scribe. Each of these innovations, by breaking up large blocks of text, reduced the cognitive load and provided natural stopping points, making it easier for a scribe to take a micro break or indeed a brief nap, and then seamlessly pick up where they left off without losing their place. It was about chunking information, making it more manageable for a wary brain. So, the medieval scribe's nap, born of an immediate human need, might have had a far broader and more subtle impact on the very architecture of written communication. It was a silent, unacknowledged force shaping the readability and structure of the books that would eventually pass into our hands. When you next find yourself appreciating a well-formatted book with clear paragraphs and helpful punctuation, remember that you might be experiencing the ripple effect of a tired scribe, simply needing a few moments of glorious, restorative slumber. It's a testament to how even the most personal acts can have profound, systemic consequences. Let's consider the fascinating interplay between the sacred and the mundane in the medieval scribe's life, and how the invention of the nap perfectly encapsulates this dynamic. On one hand, their work was infused with deep spiritual meaning. Copying sacred texts was seen as an act of devotion, a form of prayer in itself. The scriptorium was often a silent, almost hallowed space. On the other hand, the scribe was a flesh and blood human being, subject to all the natural limitations of the body: hunger, cold, pain, and, most powerfully, fatigue. The nap was the ultimate mundane interruption to a sacred pursuit, a stark reminder of human frailty. A mainstream historical fact is that monastic rules often emphasized the importance of humility and the subjugation of the body for spiritual advancement. Yet, the body, with its undeniable needs, often asserted its own authority. You're trying to elevate your spirit, but your body is screaming for a few minutes of glorious unconsciousness. It's a constant tug of war. A quirky tidbit: some medieval allegorical texts depict virtues and vices as battling within the human soul. One might imagine a tiny personification of sloth, whispering temptations of sleep into a scribe's ear, battling against the valiant diligence. The reality, of course, was less dramatic and more biological. Historians still argue whether the monastic emphasis on physical endurance and self-denial inadvertently made the need for unscheduled rest, like napping, even more pressing as a form of biological recalibration. The harder they pushed, the more the body pushed back. The nap was a silent act of rebellion against the spiritual ideal of tireless devotion. It was the body saying, "I admire your piety, but I also need a break." It wasn't about disrespecting the sacred text. It was about the simple inability to continue functioning at a high level, without a momentary physical and mental reset. This tension between the spiritual ideal and the physical reality created a unique environment where the nap, though never formally enshrined, became an unspoken necessity. It was an acknowledgement that even divine work had to be performed by human hands and brains got tired. The very humanity of the scribes is what makes their story, and their accidental invention, so relatable. They weren't superhuman automatons. They were individuals striving to fulfill a demanding role under difficult conditions. Their moments of fatigue, and their subsequent naps, are a powerful reminder of this shared humanity. The monastic life, for all its strictures, had to make accommodations for the undeniable realities of human physiology. The nap, in this sense, was a pragmatic concession, a quiet acknowledgement that even the most devout soul needed to sometimes close its eyes and simply rest. It wasn't a sin. It was a biological imperative. And in this delicate balance, the scribe found a way to bridge the gap between the divine calling and the earthly limitations. They kept the sacred flame of knowledge burning, even if it meant briefly dimming their own lights for a few precious moments. This silent, unsung struggle, this quiet triumph of the body's wisdom, is what makes the medieval scribe's nap so profoundly compelling. It's a testament to the enduring power of human nature, a quiet story woven into the very fabric of history, reminding us that sometimes the most sacred acts are simply allowing ourselves the grace of rest. Let's explore the legacy of the medieval scribe's invention of the nap in the realm of workplace culture and employee well-being, even thousands of years before such concepts were formally discussed. While the medieval scriptorium was far from a modern office, the underlying principles of managing human energy and productivity were inadvertently being explored. The tacit acceptance of the scribe's nap, however informal, represents an early, albeit primitive, understanding that sustained, high-quality intellectual work requires intermittent periods of rest. It was a precursor to modern productivity theories that advocate for breaks and downtime. A mainstream historical fact is that pre-industrial work rhythms were often more fluid than today's rigid schedules, often dictated by natural light and seasonal changes, allowing for more organic breaks. However, intense, year-round indoor labor, like that of scribes, presented unique challenges that foreshadowed modern workplace issues. You're essentially seeing the very first, very quiet labor relations discussion played out in the silent scriptorium. A quirky tidbit: some modern companies, particularly in tech industries, have embraced the concept of flexible work hours and even designated nap areas, recognizing that a rested employee is a more productive and creative one. It's almost as if they've rediscovered a truth that medieval scribes intuitively understood. From manuscript to Silicon Valley, the nap endures. Historians still argue whether the implicit knowledge gained from observing scribe fatigue and its resolution through brief rests influenced later, more formal discussions about work-life balance or optimal working conditions in early modern institutions. It's a subtle but intriguing line of inquiry. The scribe's experience highlights the distinction between mere physical presence and true mental engagement. A scribe who was physically present but mentally exhausted was unproductive and prone to error. A brief nap, even if it meant a temporary absence from the desk, restored mental acuity and ultimately led to higher quality work. This fundamental insight, that true productivity is linked to a rested mind, is something we are still grappling with in our always-on, hyper-connected world. The medieval scribe's nap, therefore, serves as a powerful, ancient precedent for the modern emphasis on employee well-being. It underscores the idea that investing in rest, even short bursts of it, is not a luxury but a strategic imperative for sustained performance. It's a silent protest against the notion of continuous, unbroken labor. The sheer human resilience of the scribes, in navigating such demanding conditions, speaks volumes. They were, in a sense, demonstrating the need for self-care long before the term existed. Their quiet rebellion against chronic exhaustion provided a blueprint for how to cope with demanding intellectual labor, a blueprint that remains remarkably relevant. So, When you hear about companies investing in employee wellness programs or encouraging regular breaks, remember the medieval scribe. They were the original proponents of the power nap, the unsung pioneers of workplace well-being, demonstrating through their own weary bodies that sometimes the best way to get work done is to briefly stop doing it and simply rest. It's a timeless lesson, echoing through the ages, reminding us that even in the most rigid and demanding environments, human needs will always find a way to assert themselves. Let's imagine the distinct sensory details that would have both contributed to the scribe's exhaustion and made the eventual nap such a powerful relief. Picture the smell of the scriptorium, a rich, earthy aroma of parchment, which is essentially dried animal skin, combined with the slightly metallic tang of iron gall ink. There would be the faint scent of beeswax from candles, and perhaps the damp, musty smell of ancient stone walls, especially in a poorly ventilated space. This constant bombardment of distinct, often heavy, smells would settle into the air, contributing to a sense of enclosure and a subtle dulling of the senses, making one feel sluggish. A mainstream historical fact is that monastic buildings, often built of stone, retained cold in winter and heat in summer, making temperature regulation a constant challenge and affecting the comfort of the occupants. You're not just working, you're living in a perpetual climate battle. A quirky tidbit is that some pigments used for illuminations, like verdigris, a copper-based green, could emit faint, unpleasant odors, and even be somewhat toxic if inhaled in quantity, further contributing to a less than invigorating atmosphere. Imagine inhaling faint chemical fumes all day while trying to concentrate. A nap would be a welcome escape from that sensory overload. Historians still argue whether the cumulative effect of constant smells, dim light, and unchanging temperatures in the scriptorium contributed significantly to scribe fatigue, or was simply a background element that scribes eventually adapted to. It's a question of sensory habituation versus persistent drain. The soundscape of the scriptorium was primarily silence, broken only by the scratch of quills, the rustle of turning pages, and perhaps the distant sounds of monastic life, the bells, or the chanting from the chapel. While conducive to concentration, this profound lack of auditory stimulation could also be soporific. There's no sudden noise to jolt you awake, no dynamic sound to keep your brain engaged. It's a very steady, rhythmic, almost hypnotic environment. This sonic monotony, combined with the visual monotony of endless lines of text, created a perfect recipe for mental drift and eventually, sleep. The visual environment was similarly unchanging. Rows of carols, shelves of books, the same stone walls day in and day out. There was little to stimulate the eye beyond the intricate details of the text itself. This lack of visual dynamism could contribute to eye fatigue and a general mental lassitude, leading to the desire to simply close your eyes and escape the unchanging visual field. Imagine staring at the same pattern for hours. Eventually, your brain just wants a break from processing it. The taste and feel of their simple, often bland diet also contributed. Meals were functional, not designed for sensory pleasure. The taste of ale, a common monastic drink, would be hydrating but also mildly sedating, especially after a long day of work. The overall sensory experience of the scriptorium, therefore, was one of quiet intensity and subtle dulling. It was an environment that, while designed for focused labor, inadvertently created a pervasive sense of mental and physical fatigue, making the brief escape of a nap not just desirable, but a deeply felt, almost primal need. The nap was a sensory reset, a moment of blissful oblivion from the constant, low-level sensory drain. It was the body's natural defense against an environment that, while conducive to scholarly work, was profoundly taxing on the human system. So, when you lie down tonight, consider the quiet, sensory world of the medieval scribe, and how their journey through its subtle discomforts ultimately led them to discover the profound comfort and necessity of a good, honest nap. It's a silent, sensory story that still resonates. Let's consider the economic realities of the medieval book market, and how this, surprisingly, played a role in necessitating the scribe's nap. In an era before mass production, every book was a handcrafted luxury item, incredibly expensive and valuable. The cost of materials, especially parchment, was prohibitive, and the labor involved was immense. This meant that each manuscript represented a significant investment, and any errors or delays in production could have serious economic consequences for the monastery. A mainstream historical fact is that books were often commissioned by wealthy patrons, nobles, or religious institutions, and the production of a single large manuscript could take years and cost as much as a small farm. You're not just producing a book, you're producing a major piece of capital, and its value depends entirely on your tireless efforts. A quirky tidbit. Some medieval manuscripts even had special contracts drawn up between the patron and the monastery, detailing the number of pages, the quality of illumination, and the expected completion date. Imagine the pressure of signing a contract for a book that will take you 5 years to produce, knowing that any slowdown from fatigue could lead to penalties. Historians still argue whether the economic pressure to produce high-quality manuscripts efficiently led to stricter work schedules for scribes, inadvertently increasing fatigue, or if it prompted a more pragmatic approach to managing rest to ensure consistent output. It's a debate about cause and effect. Did pressure create fatigue, or did fatigue demand better management? The need to maximize productivity and minimize waste was paramount. A tired scribe was a liability. Errors not only wasted expensive parchment and ink, but also wasted the incredibly valuable labor time of the scribe himself. A well-rested scribe, even if they took a short nap, would be more accurate and therefore more economically efficient in the long run. The few minutes of lost production during a nap would be more than compensated for by the avoidance of costly errors that might require hours or even days to correct. So, the nap, far from being an indulgence, was a shrewd economic decision, albeit an unconscious one. It was an investment in accuracy and efficiency. The monastery, in its pursuit of economic viability and the production of valuable assets, would have implicitly benefited from its scribes finding ways to maintain their mental sharpness. It was a trade-off, a few minutes of rest now to avoid hours of corrections later. The very competitiveness of the medieval book market, where different monastic scriptoria and later secular workshops vied for commissions, would have also put pressure on productivity and quality. A monastery with a reputation for producing highly accurate and beautifully rendered manuscripts would attract more patrons and secure more valuable commissions. The nap, by contributing to accuracy, played a quiet role in maintaining this reputation. You were not just a scribe, you were a key component in a sophisticated, albeit slow, economic system. The silent understanding that a brief rest could prevent a costly error was a crucial element in the economics of medieval book production. It was a pragmatic realization that human limits, if ignored, could lead to significant financial and reputational losses. So, the next time you consider the value of a good night's sleep or a quick power nap, remember that this modern understanding of rest and productivity has deep, economic roots, stretching back to the diligent medieval scribes who, in their quiet struggle against exhaustion, inadvertently pioneered a powerful truth about human capital and the cost of fatigue. It's a compelling economic story etched into the very fabric of history. Let's delve into the actual process of sleep and wakefulness in the medieval period, and how the absence of modern comforts and understanding made the scribe's accidental invention of the nap even more remarkable. For starters, the concept of a single, continuous block of sleep, as we generally practice today, was not universal in the medieval world. Many historical sources suggest that people often practiced biphasic sleep, where they would go to bed shortly after dusk, wake up for a few hours in the middle of the night for prayer, contemplation, or even light tasks, and then return to sleep until dawn. A mainstream historical fact is that descriptions of first sleep and second sleep are common in medieval literature and domestic records, indicating a distinct nocturnal waking period for many people across various social strata. This pattern would naturally segment the night, and for a scribe already rising hours before dawn, this could mean even more broken, less restorative sleep. You're not just tired, you're chronically sleep deprived in a different way than modern humans. This fragmented sleep pattern meant that by the time the midday slump hit, the scribe would be operating on an accumulated sleep deficit that was perhaps even greater than what a modern person experiences. The body's natural desire for a continuous rest period, denied at night, would assert itself with even greater force during the day. A quirky tidbit, the middle of the night waking period, often referred to as the watch, was sometimes used for prayer, quiet contemplation, or even mundane tasks like tending to the fire. For scribes, this could have included preparing their quills or organizing their parchment for the day ahead, further blurring the lines between rest and preparation for work. Historians still argue whether biphasic sleep patterns were a universal norm in medieval Europe, or primarily a feature of agrarian societies and monastic life. but their existence certainly impacted the daily rhythms of scribes. The absence of modern alarm clocks and consistent artificial lighting meant that waking and sleeping rhythms were much more closely tied to the natural cycle of day and night. For a scribe, this meant that the precious hours of daylight were maximized for work, pushing them to their physical limits. When the sun began to dip, their natural inclination would be to wind down. But the demands of their craft often compelled them to continue working by dim candlelight, further taxing their eyes and minds. There was no concept of blue light filters or ergonomic desks. The sleep hygiene was, by modern standards, appalling. Beds were often simple pallets, cold and hard. The air in their living quarters could be stuffy or frigid. There were no noise-cancelling headphones to block out the sounds of the monastery. All these factors would contribute to less restorative nighttime sleep, making the daytime nap even more crucial for maintaining any semblance of functionality. So, the medieval scribe was operating under a double whammy, a potentially fragmented nocturnal sleep pattern, and intensely demanding daytime labor in uncomfortable conditions. It's a wonder they got anything done at all, let alone produced such masterpieces. This context makes their accidental invention of the nap not just a clever adaptation, but a profound testament to the human body's intrinsic wisdom and its relentless pursuit of equilibrium. It was a silent rebellion against the tyranny of broken sleep and endless toil. And as you prepare for your own uninterrupted slumber, perhaps a moment of appreciation for those who navigated a world so different from our own, and in doing so, gifted us with the quiet power of the nap. Their struggle and their solution resonate across the centuries, reminding us of the enduring human need for rest. Let's consider the psychological and spiritual benefits that the medieval scribe might have inadvertently gained from their naps, extending beyond mere physical rest. While driven by exhaustion, these brief moments of unconsciousness could have offered profound mental and emotional recalibration, impacting their well-being in ways they may not have fully articulated. Imagine the constant internal monologue of a scribe, the intricate details of Latin grammar, the fear of errors, the spiritual weight of the texts. A nap would provide a complete cessation of this mental churning, a silent interlude where the mind could truly empty itself. This forced mental break could lead to a sense of clarity and renewed perspective upon waking, a psychological reset button. A mainstream historical fact is that monastic life placed a strong emphasis on mental discipline and combating distracting thoughts, often through repetitive prayer and meditation. A nap, while not a formal spiritual practice, could have offered a similar mental quietude, albeit involuntarily. You're achieving a state of mental emptiness, even if you didn't mean to. A quirky tidbit, some contemplative spiritual traditions across various cultures involve practices that induce trance-like or semi-sleep states for spiritual insight. While the scribe's nap was driven by fatigue, it might have inadvertently touched upon a similar state of deep mental relaxation, offering a brief respite from the anxieties of daily life. Perhaps they returned to their work with a renewed sense of purpose, even a subtle spiritual refreshment. Historians still argue whether the implicit understanding of rest in monastic life was solely for physical recuperation or also recognized the mental and spiritual benefits of quiet repose, even if only in passing references. It's a debate about the holistic view of medieval well-being. The act of napping could also have been a crucial pressure release. The relentless demands, the high stakes, the constant self-correction, all contributed to significant stress. A brief nap offered a momentary escape from this pressure cooker, allowing the body's stress response to calm down. Upon waking, the scribe might feel a sense of psychological decompression, better equipped to handle the continued demands of their work. It's like pressing the reset button on a frayed nervous system. Furthermore, these naps could have offered a temporary reprieve from the profound monotony of their work. While the content was intellectually rich, the process of copying was inherently repetitive. A nap, by breaking this cycle, could have introduced a small, almost imperceptible sense of novelty or change, alleviating the mental tedium and preventing outright burnout. It's like restarting a long, boring drive after a quick stop. The road still stretches ahead, but your perspective is refreshed. The subconscious processing that occurs during sleep, even brief sleep, could also have played a role. Problems that seemed insurmountable before the nap might appear clearer or more soluble upon waking. The brain, freed from conscious effort, could have been quietly working on solutions or consolidating information, leading to those moments that sometimes follow a short doze. So, the medieval scribe's nap was far more than just a remedy for physical tiredness. It was a powerful, albeit unintended, tool for psychological and spiritual well-being, offering mental clarity, stress relief, and a vital break from monotony. It allowed them to maintain their mental fortitude and continue their invaluable work of preserving knowledge. Their invention was truly holistic, a testament to the complex interplay of body, mind, and spirit, even in the most demanding of circumstances. And as you close your eyes for your own moments of rest, remember the quiet profundity of the scribe's humble snooze, a silent testament to human resilience and the enduring power of restorative sleep. Let's now consider the subtle ways in which the scribe's environment, particularly the materials they used, inadvertently reinforced the need for the nap. It wasn't just the physical act of writing, but the very nature of the parchment, the ink, and the light that conspired to exhaust them. Imagine working on parchment that wasn't perfectly smooth. Sometimes it would have natural imperfections, small bumps, or areas where the ink wouldn't flow perfectly. This would require the scribe to apply varying pressure, to adjust their hand and quill, to constantly adapt to the irregularities of the surface. This continuous micro-adjustment, far from being a simple task, would cumulatively lead to significant hand and wrist fatigue, making a brief rest a necessity. A mainstream historical fact is that the preparation of parchment was a laborious process, involving stretching, scraping, and bleaching animal skins, and even the best examples often retained some natural variations in texture and thickness. You're not just writing on paper, you're battling the remnants of a cow. A quirky tidbit: some scribes would occasionally use small, smooth stones or polished bone tools to burnish the parchment, making it smoother and more receptive to ink. This was an added manual labor that further contributed to their overall physical drain, making any respite even more welcome. Imagine having to iron your paper before you can write on it. Historians still argue whether the physical properties of parchment themselves contributed more to scribe fatigue than the mental demands of the content, or if it was simply a combined effect that made the work uniquely arduous. It's a debate about the primary source of their exhaustion. The ink, as we've discussed, was temperamental, but beyond its flow, consider its color and how it interacted with the dim light. Often, the ink was a rich, dark black, which against the creamy white or off-white of the parchment, created good contrast. However, as the light faded, or under the smoky glow of a candle, this contrast would diminish, forcing the scribe to strain their eyes even more. The very darkness of the ink, combined with poor lighting, would turn the act of reading and writing into an intense visual workout, quickly leading to eye fatigue and the inevitable desire to close your eyes. The constant dipping of the quill into the inkwell was another repetitive action. Each dip was a small interruption to the flow, a moment of re-engagement. While seemingly minor, the sheer volume of dips over hours and days would add up, contributing to the repetitive strain and the mental rhythm that could become hypnotic and lead to drowsiness. It's like a tiny, continuous mental speed bump. The very instruments of their trade, therefore, conspired against the scribe's wakefulness. The uneven surfaces, the temperamental ink, the insufficient lighting, and the repetitive motions all coalesced into an environment that maximized physical and visual strain, making the body's natural response to seek rest almost inevitable. The nap, in this context, wasn't just a choice. It was a physical imperative, a natural reaction to the overwhelming demands placed upon their senses and their bodies. So, as you reflect on the medieval scribe's journey, remember that their invention of the nap was deeply intertwined with the very physicality of their craft, a silent testament to the resilience of the human body and its ingenious ways of finding moments of respite, even amidst the most challenging material conditions. It's a subtle but powerful insight into the origins of our most beloved daytime indulgence. Let's conclude our journey through the medieval scribe's world by reflecting on the profound, quiet triumph that their accidental invention of the nap represents. It wasn't a discovery born of scientific inquiry or intentional innovation, but rather a universal human response to overwhelming demands. It was the body's subtle, insistent rebellion against chronic fatigue, a testament to the enduring power of biological necessity over rigid systems and societal expectations. Imagine the countless scribes, across centuries and monastic orders, independently succumbing to that irresistible pull of sleep, each contributing, in their own quiet way, to the collective recognition of the nap's restorative power. A mainstream historical fact is that despite the widespread destruction of libraries and manuscripts during various periods of upheaval, a vast treasury of ancient knowledge survived through the tireless efforts of medieval scribes. Their very existence is a testament to their endurance, which, we now know, often included brief periods of unconsciousness. You are witnessing the silent, unsung heroes of literacy, one glorious snooze at a time. A quirky tidbit, the phrase, "to catch 40 winks," is thought to have originated from a time when a quick nap was literally measured by the number of times a person would blink their eyes, implying a very short duration. It speaks to the recognition of even the briefest moments of rest as beneficial, a concept undoubtedly familiar to the medieval scribe. Historians still argue whether the collective, unspoken practice of napping among scribes created a de facto cultural norm for intellectual workers that subtly influenced later attitudes towards rest and productivity in scholarly pursuits. It's a profound thought, the nap, as a cultural artifact born from medieval exhaustion. The medieval scribe's nap was an unsung act of genius. It was a form of self-regulation, a quiet act of bio-optimization centuries before the term existed. They weren't just preserving ancient texts, they were, in their own wary way, preserving their own capacity to do so. Their story reminds us that true efficiency isn't about endlessly pushing limits, but about intelligently managing resources, including the most vital resource of all, human energy. Their legacy is not just in the beautiful manuscripts that fill our museums and libraries, but in the universal understanding that a short period of rest can unlock renewed focus, creativity, and endurance. Every time you lean back in your chair for a quick snooze, or find yourself drifting off on the couch after a demanding task, you are participating in a timeless tradition, a direct descendant of the quiet, ink-stained resilience of the medieval scribe. It's a powerful, human connection across the ages. The nap, therefore, is not merely a habit. It is a profound testament to the adaptability and wisdom of the human body, a quiet triumph in the face of relentless demands. It is a gift, given inadvertently by those who toiled in the quiet corners of scriptoria, ensuring that knowledge would survive, and that tired eyes would find a moment of peace. And now, as our journey through the quiet world of the medieval scribe draws to a close, let your own eyelids feel heavy. The soft hum of the fan, or perhaps the gentle hush of the night outside your window, becomes a soothing lullaby. Imagine the dim, flickering candlelight slowly fading, the scratch of the quill receding into the distant past. Your own breath deepens, a steady, calm rhythm. The worries of the day, like faint scribbles on old parchment, begin to soften, their edges blurring into indistinct lines. There is no urgency here, no pressure to complete another page, no weight of ancient texts. Just the gentle descent into quietude. Feel the calm spreading through your body, from the tips of your toes to the crown of your head, a deep, pervasive sense of peace. The world outside, with all its demands and distractions, gently recedes, leaving only the tranquil space within you. Allow yourself to float effortlessly on this soft current of peace. Rest easy, knowing that even in the deepest slumber, the human spirit continues its timeless journey, always seeking balance, always finding its way back to rest. Sweet dreams.